Hello, everybody, and welcome to this latest UK in a Changing Europe lunch hour. And today, timed, we thought, to coincide with the end of COP28 in Dubai. We're here to discuss whether the UK can still claim to be a climate change leader. And to do that, I'm joined by a terrific panel from the University of East Anglia, Professor of Environment Policy, Andy Jordan. From the University of Lancaster, Professor of Environment and Climate Governance, Becky Willis. And from here in London, from E3G, Cutting Edge Environment and Climate Change NGO, is their co-CEO. We can explore that in more depth later if questions run out. Shane Tomlinson. So remember, post your questions on Slido. Please remember to upvote any questions you really like, even though obviously they're slightly less good than the way you would have put it. Then we can make sure that we get the panel to answer those. And we'll definitely be ended by 2 o'clock, more or less. This isn't a COP, so we're not going to ask you to sort of bed in for the night, run out of food, and starve you into agreeing a final text. So, I'm going to kick off with Shane. Shane, E3G have got a lot of people out in Dubai, even if you're not there. So what's your latest reading on where we're getting to? Is there going to be a adequate final text agreed?
Thanks, Jill. Yes, and I have to claim that I was for a while in a past life a UK negotiator, so I do remember those late nights, and I'm very pleased to not be doing it today, and so joining you from the comfort of London. So I think sort of several things around before we get to sort of where we might get to. So I think it's obviously worth emphasising that COP28 is not a cup final. So this is a stepping stone on the way to COP30, which is the next round of NDC. So it's really important that we make progress this year, but this isn't deciding everything. And so we have to see it in that broader context. We made a lot of progress during week 1 of the COP, in particular, which was a historic first, agreeing to the loss and damage fund and then the capitalization of that on day 1, I think was a surprise to everyone and really a genuinely historic moment. As was the Leaders' Declaration on Food and Agriculture, which was the first time that leaders have really talked about that and engaged about that in a UNFCCC setting. And we saw a range of other initiatives and announcements that have come forward that added quite a lot of positive momentum into the negotiations. However, as is traditional, that momentum is now sort of running into the road of the red lines of negotiators. And in particular, we're now in a very challenging endgame focused on the text around the phase out of fossil fuels or the phase down of fossil fuels, and whether they are abated or unabated or another form of language that we may come up with. There are obviously other things going on, but that's become, I think, it's probably the central fulcrum of what's going to define this endgame. There's still a lot to play for, and many things can change. I think a lot of countries, and myself in particular, were disappointed with the text that came out yesterday that rolled back on the fossil phase out language very significantly. But there's lots of action and effort happening now and ministerial engagement to hopefully push that forward. So we will see where we get to in the next 48 hours. My understanding is that they have to vacate the convention centre on Friday, as there's a Christmas convention starting on Friday. So Father Christmas is coming to Dubai. We may find out which countries get coal or perhaps oil in their stocking rather than presents, but we're in that tense endgame. So we will see where we get to. But I think whatever the outcome of this, I don't think we should lose emphasis and focus on the progress that was made in week 1. We will have achieved some significant steps forward, even if we have a very difficult endgame. And I think this has resolved a lot in terms of putting the focus on, this really is OPEC and a group of countries like that, who are blocking this progress. And we've got now sharp resolution on where those dividing lines are coming. So I think the UNFCCC has done its job in providing a genuine voice to the most vulnerable and the most impacted in these negotiations. This will be a failure of the parties, not the process, if we don't get the outcome that we really need.
That's really interesting. Alok Sharma was on the radio this morning, rather suggesting that this was a bit of a sort of last hope to keep 1.5, which, remember, at the end of COP26 in Glasgow, he said was on life support, that basically they'd be turning the life support off if they didn't reach a decent agreement here. But actually, in the real world, Shane, what difference would it make if the final declaration says phase out fossil fuels rather than phase down, or indeed has this sort of floppy text about here are a few things you could do if you felt like it on a wet afternoon? So what really difference does it make, the language that comes out of the COP?
So I think there's a couple of things, and I very much hope that it is phased out and not phased down. Fundamentally, climate change is a cooperation issue. So it is a global public good, and if we do not have cooperation between countries, we will never be able to do that. So the security of British citizens and other citizens around the world require us to be able to cooperate internationally to solve these issues. And so the UNFCCC plays an absolutely vital role in doing that. If countries can see that other countries are moving with them, they are likely to do more. And there's also important things such as providing financial support and aid to those most impacted and those most vulnerable who won't be able to cope with climate change if we don't provide it. And so the UNFCCC really does matter at those stakes. The stakes are really real and live. That doesn't really replace the bottom-up action that we have to do. So we can't solve it all through the top-down lens. That is absolutely clear. We have to get on to delivery, and I'm sure we'll come on to that in the UK context later in this discussion. But the UK cannot solve climate change on its own, although it does need to play its part. And therefore, it does matter that we are part of an international process, that we're able to make progress there, and that we're able to make sure that other countries are taking action as well as ourselves.
So Jill's frozen for me. Has she for you, Andy and Shane?
Yes, sorry.
Should we manage without her? I had some things to say about what you
said. I was
said.
going to say, Rebecca, why don't you jump in as well?
I mean, yeah, Shane, I would definitely defer to your expertise on international negotiations, because I am not a COP hound. I look much more at how national governments try and meet their international obligations. But I think it is worth pointing out, for those not so long in the tooth, how what a significant shift happened in Paris. So the Copenhagen negotiations in 2009 basically collapsed because because countries more or less refused to have targets set for them by the international system. Welcome back, Jill. I was just replying to Shane's. I jumped in. So Copenhagen failed because countries, basically refused to have the emissions targets set for them by an international process. They, I think I have some sympathy for this. They thought that it was up to each country to bring forward their own climate strategy. And so that was the genius of Paris, the system of nationally determined contributions, whereby each country put on the table what it was going to deliver, rather than that being mandated by the top-down UN process. So I think that was, a helpful shift. And it does mean that now, we're not waiting for the outcome of this COP so that countries then scurry away and implement the targets that were agreed. It's much more, in my mind, I'd be interested to know if I'm right, Shane, it's much more in my mind about building that collective confidence between nations that, I will, if you will, that, that kind of sense of collective action. Having said that, I think the language on fossil fuel phase out is absolutely essential, and I can see why why so many countries see that as a red line. But that means that because there's more focus now on the domestic level, that means that the UK's own domestic position is more important. And that's why, and I'm sure we'll come on to this, Jill, that's why I'm so frustrated with the position the UK's in now. That I think what Rishi Sunak has been trying to do over the last couple of months is a sort of complex triangulation, whereby he keeps the net zero skeptics, who are also the Brexit lobby, on side domestically by some sort of appeasing language for them around net zero and costs and so on, but clings on to the net zero target and this idea that the UK is a climate leader. So he's trying to fudge it, and I think he thinks that he's probably successful in that, because it hasn't fallen apart, right? We still have the net zero target, we still have a climate strategy. So he's probably congratulating himself for that. But the message that sends internationally is pretty shambolic, I would have to say. And certainly, you know, I was talking to IPCC negotiators a couple of months ago, and they were saying that you know, that the UK is now not sending very helpful messages at all.
That's really useful. Sorry, everybody. I'm relying on King's Wi-Fi, which is a bit of a disaster area. I usually do these things from home because I can't trust King's Wi-Fi. So if I haven't missed this, thank you very much, Becky, for clocking that I disappeared. Andy, I'm really interested in your reading. I mean, Becky was saying that our ambiguous domestic stance has undermined. In the past, the UK has played really quite a big role in COPs, not just hosting COP26, but we've been quite a big noise previously in the EU delegation. Some of us, you know, Pete Betts, who very sadly died a few weeks ago, sort of hailed as one of the great climate change negotiators, did a lot both for the UK and the EU. Has the UK played much of a role at this COP? Has it really been hamstrung by our domestic rowing back?
Well, I mean, time will tell, I think. I think because this is the first big COP that's occurred that, you know, where the UK has not been in charge of the G7, where it's not been really within the EU 27 as it was EU 28. So this is a really crucial, I think, first test of, at least in the climate change area, of kind of global Britain. And I think many people in the climate change community were rather disappointed at what's happened in the last 6 to 12 months. A lot of focus was on the Uxbridge by-election, but to be honest, there were already very clear sort of signals well before that the UK's position was changing, particularly in relation to this crucial issue of phase down versus phase out. So if you think about, you know, the opening of a new coal mine, if you think about the you know, the opening up of new North Sea oil development opportunities, if you think about switches and changes and rollbacks in policy, you know, Britain's suddenly starting to look like it's on the wrong side of these really critical debates that are happening right now in Dubai. And the fact I've just read on the BBC website that Graham Stewart, the UK's chief negotiator, has returned to the UK, or is returning to the UK, perhaps recalled to vote tonight, I think in many ways sort of typifies the sort of situation that the UK finds itself in, you know, distracted at home, not really having the same sort of diplomatic capacity and heft that it used to have in the past.
Did it matter that Rishi Sunak basically went for just 11 hours? You know, did that sort of mark us out as taking this less seriously? We obviously had King Charles there making the opening speech. David Cameron went, who's probably better known in many of those circles than Rishi Sunak himself. You know, the UK put in its diplomatic effort, as you say. The Rwanda vote today has required Graham Stewart to scurry back, just leaving officials in the room. I'm not sure whether that matters for the end game, whether you need politicians. And, you know, Graham Stewart, with all due respect, may not be the best known heaviest weight in the UK government.
I think the media obviously focuses on these sorts of things, and certainly other politicians focus on these things. I mean, look at the howls of outrage that we see in the last 30 minutes that have greeted Graham Stewart's return to the UK. But to be honest, I think really it's how much time and effort you put in over a long period of time in the run up to a COP that's really, really important. And there's quite a few things that the UK has been doing that have really sowed seeds of doubt about its long-term interest and commitment to this area. I mean, not just the obvious things that happened after Uxbridge, but, you know, for example, Nick Bridge, the climate envoy, resigned and hasn't been replaced. I think that's really important. You know, that huge team that supported COP26 has been allowed to dissipate. So there are lots of other things that suggest that the UK hasn't really been significantly investing in this topic, in this area, quite aside from the sort of, the obvious things that have caught the headlines.
And Shane, what are the potential landings? I'm not sure whether you want to do a sort of weighted predictions of where we'll end up. I mean, is it basically either phase out or there'll be no final communique? Is there some drafting around it? Or is it basically, are they just going to duck the issue completely? And then I just wondered, before we move on to UK domestic policy, do we actually think it was a good idea for the UAE to host this COP? Is it sort of Nixon to China that takes a sort of oil producer to get the oil producers on board? Or was it always a hopelessly compromised process the moment they chaired it? Or does it not matter because they have to play an independent and partial role?
So I definitely am not going to do a weighted probability on all of the different permutations of the text, of which there are many. I think what we should say is there is overwhelming pressure on countries to get a form of a deal over the line. So in all negotiations like this, it always gets very high stakes at the end. You always end up with a lot of pressure. Countries have to be fully explore the red lines of other countries before they'll do a final negotiation. But almost always we come out with a deal at the other end of it. So Becky already talked about, there was the example of Copenhagen, which failed. There was a previous COP, I believe in Japan, where they had to have a COP bis. So they couldn't agree on the day, but they came back later in the year and agreed it. But every other time we've got a deal over the line, and so I think there's a lot of scope in order to do that. I think what is saying, this is why I was saying this is not a cup final, it's a stepping stone. This is really therefore about what is the energy and momentum and focus that we get out of the COP, which will really matter for this. And I feel this is where this has clarified a lot of the real negotiating lines as we go into the critical period in 2025, where countries agree their next round of nationally determined contributions, and that will be the real moment where we either keep 1.5 alive or we don't. And so I think that will, what the critical issues will come out of this is, we know we need to do more on finance. That is absolutely critical. So both reform of the international financial architecture, including the World Bank, but also contributions from developed countries will be really, really important. We've now exposed, obviously, the role of OPEC in this, and they played their hands. And this is where the diplomacy in the other 50 weeks of the year, as Andy was saying, will be as important as the diplomacy in the 2 weeks of COP next year. And so we need to learn the lessons from this and really invest in it. And in terms of the role of the presidency itself, I mean, it is right in the UN process. You have a rotating presidency that moves around different regions of the world each year. You will therefore get different flavors of countries and with different levels of commitment to climate action as hosts on a rotating basis. I think what is important is that we've still had a really it's been very full on, but we've had a proper set of negotiations, and that's carried on. And I think there's a point Andy made to me as we were chatting beforehand. It is also something that these sort of countries like the UAE now want to host the COP. There is something that the stakes are now really real on climate change. That means that large emitting countries are interested in playing a more central role. And in some levels, that is a real measure of success, even if it does bring some challenges with it.
That's really, really interesting. Becky, just a sort of final thought. We've heard about the huge numbers of people at the COP, the sort of, vast delegations, but also all these, civil society groups, but also business groups, including lots of, people representing, employed by the fossil fuel industry. Is that a good or a bad thing that these COPs have sort of become these sort of giant events, which must limit the number of countries that are actually capable of hosting any of these events now?
I don't think there's a definitive answer to that. I think that the very visible civil society pressure at COPs is really important. Having that oversight and a certain amount of transparency at the negotiations themselves is really important. Having said that, basically, the more money you have, the more you can influence the process. I think that's a pretty well proven, there's pretty strong evidence for that. And both through the COP process and more widely, I'm really concerned now about the way in which evidence is used and abused for climate ends. And, you know, we've seen it with, we saw it with tobacco, the phase out of tobacco. You know, we saw it over various issues like, you know, asbestos over the years. This tactic that opponents to legislation have of throwing complexity into the debate. So, you know, there's a very, and I mean, I wrote about this recently in the context of the Cumbrian coal mine. There's a very clear line of sight of evidence from 1.5 through to phasing out all fossil fuels, right? We've got almost double the amount of oil and coal and gas in existing functioning sites than we can burn, right, to reach 1.5. So it's just a statement of fact that we cannot open new sites for oil or coal or gas exploration. And yet we're still having this debate about, you know, in the context of the coal mine, about, you know, whether you know, UK coal is better or worse than foreign coal, about, you know, how you make coal without steel without coal, all that kind of thing. At the COP, we're still having debates about, you know, whether you could actually dig it out of the ground but somehow magically offset it through routes that, you know, no one's quite proven yet. And we're not actually basing this on evidence. And the reason is because people with a lot of money and power are lobbing false research into the process left, right and centre. So I think we need to be much more aware of the and spend much more time actually focusing on the evidence and being really clear, both in international processes and in national processes like the planning process for a coal mine, about what does and doesn't count as good evidence.
That's very interesting. I'm going to bring it back home. Andy, the Prime Minister has made quite a lot of the fact that the UK, as he puts it, has done more than, you know, most countries, is a real leader on our emissions record to date. We've got a question from Anonymous, hi Anonymous, that there was a lot of discussion around 2021, that the UK cut emissions fastest in the G7, G20. Is that still technically correct in 2023? So, and is that the only sort of measure that we should be looking at for climate leadership? We've called this about, is the UK still a climate change leader? I suppose a sort of slight rephrase, was the UK ever really a climate change leader? Could we claim a very good record on this or not? Then we're going to come on to, you know, where we've got to now in current policy developments. Give us a bit of a backgrounder on the UK performance to date.
I think there was a time when the UK really did lead on this issue. I mean, I'm sitting here at the University of East Anglia, you know, where the really fundamental science was done and continues to be done, working out the extent to which the climate is indeed changing. It operated within an EU context to push things like emissions trading and also reduction of emissions on other things like cars. It's also done a lot to really push through, you know, international mechanisms like the COPs. COP26, crucially, was really important for the UK. And I think also was really important in just its diplomatic powers and diplomatic capacities to push other countries into similar ways of thinking. I think, though, what's happened in recent years, and this is a point that's made not just by sort of academics, but by the Climate Change Committee, by opposition parties, by other scientists, by tracking organizations like the Climate Change Performance Index, is that the UK is no longer seen as the leader that it once was. I think there are certainly bright spots. You know, it's still pushing fast on renewable energy. It's still pushing very fast and successfully in relation to electric vehicles. But there are so many areas, though, where, you know, and again, the Climate Change Committee has made this point very eloquently in its last two progress reports, where the rate of progress needs to be a lot faster. I mean, it argues, the committee, that outside of the electricity generating area, progress really has to quadruple in the next 5 to 10 years to have any chance of achieving the, you know, 2030 targets that the UK is committed to. And I think crucially, two things, you know, policy consistency, that's really important. policy risk. I mean, that's the thing that we often refer to in relation to emerging economies, not mature democracies. And secondly, and I'm sure Becky will get onto this later on, it's about getting public consent for the changes that are really now needed outside of the electricity generating sector. Public consent, and that means an open and honest public debate. In September, when he made his speech, Sunak said he wanted an honest debate, but many of the things that he was saying were really not completely transparent and honest. So, for example, he was talking about changing policy targets and changing, the times when certain things were banned, but only really talking about the costs, when in fact he could have also, and it would have been more honest also to talk about the benefits, benefits of warmer homes in the winter or cooler homes in the summer, those sorts of things, greater energy security as well.
So Becky, you've been doing research among MPs about their attitudes, and I think you did some sort of training in the run up to one of the elections of potential candidates about climate change, but you've also been very involved in some of these citizens' assemblies that we've seen, particularly the one commissioned by Parliament. Do you think, I mean, Rishi Sunak has clearly decided that he's moving policy to nearer where the public is and to nearer where his MPs want to be on climate change, with what he's described as a sort of more pragmatic and proportionate approach, as he announced in September. But where do you think public opinion and indeed political opinion really sits on this now?
Yeah, well, we've researched both sides of that. In terms of political opinion, and Andy was involved in this work as well. We did a set of interviews with MPs in the lead up to 2018, published in 2018, and the frightening finding at that point was how few MPs sort of had climate change as part of their active agenda, would speak on it, sort of felt they needed to have a line on it, as you might say, in slightly crass political terms. And we repeated those interviews at the end of last year and beginning of this year. And this is good news that all MPs now felt that it was firmly something on the political agenda. I mean, why did it take so long? I don't know. But, it was something that they needed a line on, that they needed to be able to say that they were, most of them needed to say that they were, in favour of climate action. And so that is a step forward. Before, MPs were saying that they felt like freaks or zealots, those their words, if they spoke out on climate change. And now they do feel that there's a pretty strong consensus that we need to grab this by the horns. So too late, but a good step forward. The trouble comes the step down, where MPs still lack confidence about. That they agree on the kind of challenge of climate change, but lack confidence about levels of political and public support for the measures to achieve that. The difficulty with that is that creates a sort of silent standoff between people and politicians, because politicians are scared to speak out on the measures that they might want to suggest, because they worry that there'll be a public backlash, and vice versa. And the most interesting research that we've done recently, which was last year, was with a very detailed work with a group of members of the public, sort of representative sample. And when you ask them, the more they find out about climate change, obviously the more worried they are, and the more they want government leadership. But also, the more they find out, actually, the more worried they are about the ability of government to step up to the plate. So, their levels of concern are rising. Their desire for government leadership is rising, and at the same time, their trust and confidence in ability to get the job, and government's ability to get the job done, decreases. And so that's pretty miserable, right? But in there, I think there's a kernel of something that a clever politician could really seize on, and that is active political leadership. So, if a politician, and if there's anyone on this call who might be part of any sort of government from next year onwards, you know, any thoughtful politician could actually turn that round and say, you know what, we know that we're all really worried about climate change. We know there's we know that there's lots that we can do about it. We know that there are really strong economic and health benefits to doing so. Going out on the front foot in that way would actually mean that you bring, you know, that you get that public support. Because, you know, if there's one phrase I absolutely hate, it's when politicians and people within the climate community say, we need to bring people with us. And in fact, the evidence shows that people are there, you know, waiting to be part of it. They want to see government doing a lot more. So it's actually that they want to, you know, that people want to bring the government with them and not vice versa. So, you know, for me, that's a political win for the taking. But it does need, you know, it needs a thoughtful narrative. It needs a real emphasis on the co-benefits as well as climate, and it needs confident leadership. And you know, this government has actually gone backward on that by what I was talking about a while ago, by trying to do this sort of messy triangulation of trying to keep the skeptics on board.
So, Andy, one reason why the government's gone backwards, and I'll bring in Shane on this as well, is clearly because they're worried about the cost implication. You mentioned they emphasize only the cost, not the benefits. But there are costs of some of these things. You know, now they may come down, and we know that the absolutely top of mind, even higher up than stopping small boats, is still cost of living, and that's one of the things that seems to have, you know, whether it's frightened or energized the Prime Minister into moving permission. And we also know that, you know, any government's not going to have huge amounts of fiscal room for manoeuvre and an awful lot of demands on public spending. So actually, if you were the government, Conservatives wanting to make progress or whatever, recognizing those pressures on cost of living, how actually would you start sort of addressing, you know, the need for change, but combining it with something that does recognize that there are some really quite real constraints on what you can ask people, or indeed the government, to pay at the moment?
Yeah, sure. So I think there's two sources of information about what public thinks about this. One are the sort of deliberative approaches, which Becky talked about. It's quite interesting and the biggest deliberative exercise was, of course, the Climate Change Assembly, which Becky was involved in. And I think what was really interesting to come out of that were in many ways the principles which were determined autonomously in a bottom-up sort of way within the Assembly. And the top three, number one was informing and educating. That was the point that Becky made. Second was fairness. You know, let's do this in a fair sort of way. I think the point you were sort of moving towards. And the third one was government leadership. So, you know, so if we put people together and give them lots of information on these things, then they do come up with quite sort of sophisticated, nuanced understandings. The other way of thinking about how and understanding how publics think is, of course, to undertake surveys, and government departments have been undertaking sort of tracker surveys for years and years, starting with DEC. And what do these show? I mean, generally they show that publics over time have become more concerned, more worried, and feel more strongly about climate change. Generally, they want governments and also businesses to lead. They generally sort of feel that net zero and decarbonisation are going to be good. But dig into the detail, though, and you start to see differences, party political differences. So, for example, support for things like dietary changes and bans on frequent flyers tend to be found more amongst Green voters and Labour voters, particularly those that are more highly educated and have higher incomes, whereas those who are particularly sort of keener on technical fixes like nuclear power, for example, and who strongly resist the idea of banning things and really heavily regulating things, tend to be those who vote for those on the right. So in some ways, I think Sunak was probably onto something when he was targeting, you know, bans on cars and bans on boilers. But the problem is that we really desperately, from a scientific perspective, really need action on these sorts of two issues. And from a political perspective, it didn't really work either for Sunak because he didn't really enjoy a sudden bounce in the polls.
And Shane, we've got quite a lot of comments coming in about Labour, what Labour can do. Top rated question is from Anonymous. There's a lot of Anonymous on this timeline. What could Labour do to recover the UK's leadership role on climate? We've seen Labour's mission about becoming a clean energy superpower, decarbonising power by 2030. Do you think the Labour plans are a real step change? And actually, do they add up? Are they at all feasible, or are we going to end up with another bunch of missed targets?
So I think the Labour plans definitely represent a quantum step forward compared in the level of ambition. I think that is deeply welcome as we go there. Back to your previous question, I would also separate the difference between a cost and an investment. And so, yes, there are costs here, but there's also a lot of investment here, which is about getting the gains that come with that. And a lot of this comes down, I think, to questions around things like international competitiveness. There is a race at the moment to be the country that leads on low carbon technology. The US has its Inflation Reduction Act, and it's looking to invest to create its leadership there. Europe has the Green Deal, and they are doing likewise. China is investing very heavily in its renewables and other low carbon technology sectors. And so there is a real thing that if the UK doesn't act soon, we're going to end up doing is losing out on that competitive advantage as we go forward. So I think Labour's plan really do take a step forward. It is the right quantum. We can talk about the sort of the 28 billion and how and when that will be delivered and the challenges around it. But I think it is the right thing to do. These are investments in climate not only build resilience for the UK, they also build competitive advantage, and therefore they are the right sort of things for spending money on. Unlike, should we say, £300 million for a Rwanda's migration scheme, or an Eat Out to Help Out scheme, or all of those other things which rack up large debt on current spending but don't have any long-term benefit. And so I think we really do need to separate between those as we go forward. Labour does have its fiscal rules, so it's claimed that it will close the deficit on day-to-day spending over 5 years, that it will make sure government debt is falling at the end of 5 years, and that it will only borrow to invest. And so given what potentially will be quite a difficult economic outlook, we'll know more when the Bank of England sets its rates on Thursday. It's looking like we may have quite a challenging economic backdrop going into next year. And so definitely money will be tight. But I think you can make a very credible argument for why climate investments are the smart and the right thing to prioritise within that, and would be affordable almost under any scenario as we go forward.
Now, Andy, one of Labour's other missions is to be the fastest growing economy in the G7. I'm not quite sure why they've set themselves a relative target, but they have. Last week, when the Resolution Foundation launched their giant Stagnation Nation report, one of their points was that we have to do net zero, but it's changed the composition of the economy. It wasn't a sort of driver of growth in itself. And indeed, some of the things you might do to get to net zero might be drags on growth. I mean, do you think that that we should be looking to net zero as a source of growth, as the US seems to be doing in the Inflation Reduction Act? Is there a sort of UK version of IRA that would make sense for us, which is something that Labour sort of hints at but doesn't give that many details on? What would you be advising in that space?
I think a lot of attention over the last few months has been on the Tories' 5 tests for obvious reasons. But I think the more that the Tories stagnate in the polls, the more people are starting to look at Labour's 5 missions. And it's quite interesting that of all those 5 missions, none actually contain climate change in the title, in the sort of headline title. The one that's most relevant to climate change is the one on energy. And that's around the creation of GB Energy. So that'll be a facility which will be able to fund sort of higher risk, particularly renewable energy investments. But the justification for those things is generally in non-climate terms. It's things like energy security, it's about jobs, it's about green skills. So one gets a sense that Labour hasn't yet sort of really completely decided how it wants to go into this next election. I mean, in relation to climate change, I think two things to bear in mind. I think, first of all, yes, it's great to be able to wheel out the big guns, things like, you know, the IRA in the US and the equivalent in the EU. But when you're a single sort of country, it's very difficult to relatively small countries, very difficult to sort of raise such large, you know, amounts of money that you can help to subsidize all the good things in relation to climate change that you might want to do. And the second thing is there's also some aspects of what Labour's proposing that leave many environmentalists feeling quite queasy. The idea, for example, that you might want to sort of bulldoze, quote unquote, through the planning system to get, you know, new forms of infrastructure, greener infrastructure in place, I think also has raised concerns. I mean, it was that very language, for example, that got Liz Truss in so much hot water with the environmental groups.
And Becky, yeah, do you think Labour's got a chance of recovering the UK's leadership role on climate? What would it need to do?
Yeah, I think I'm less worried than Andy about the language, about, you know, putting the co-benefits to the front. I think, you know, there's been this long-running debate about, you know, do you sell the message on climate grounds, or do you keep quiet about climate and say that this is all about, you know, improving, making people's homes warmer, or, you know, whatever those co-benefits are. I think we've solved that one. It has to be both and. Partly because both and is the honest answer, and also because both and fits exactly with what people, and, you know, we see this time and time again in the processes we run, it fits with what people say they want, that they're concerned about climate change, they want government leadership, and they also want policies that, you know, that work for them, that work for their lives, that help in terms of health, economic benefits, and so on. So I think, so I suppose where I do agree with you, Andy, is that I'm intensely relaxed about Labour selling out on grounds of fairness or economy, but I think there should be a bit more of the climate in the both and I don't see any electoral downside to that. Maybe their focus groups are saying differently. I do think that there is a danger of emphasizing too much the climate stuff, because there's a certain way of talking about climate, and particularly climate justice, and linking it to a lot of other left issues, which, while I completely understand the reasons for that, does, and again, we have evidence on this, it does put off a lot of people who, you know, who are not basically confirmed Labour voters. And, you know, for example, so Rachel Coxgoon and my team studies climate attitudes among right-wing rural voters, and that language doesn't work for them, and a lot of the policies don't work for them, actually. They're being asked to, you know, host a lot more infrastructure, a lot more energy infrastructure. They are not getting the benefits in terms of better housing stock or better transport infrastructure. And so I think one thing that Labour really needs to think about hard is the differential geography of, sorry, that was a very academic phrase, the different geographies of climate, of climate strategy, because we've tended to do this very top down, like, you know, and this is the sort of CCC approach. I can totally see why they do it, but it's like, this is the amount of carbon we need to get out of the economy. Let's run the models and say what savings can come from each sector. I think we need to disaggregate massively. I think it looks very different in rural areas. It looks very different in ex-industrial areas. It certainly looks very different in West Cumbria, where the coal mine's being proposed. And so the more that we can devolve, and the more that we can get regionally appropriate strategies, the better, I think. So that's, you know, and I think that's one area that Labour could really lead. I also think that they could lead by leaning into the sort of anti-expert thing a bit, by actually really playing up the role of people in policy making, and saying, look, we are, so, you know, Andy mentioned Climate Assembly UK. They could very easily say, we are doing this because you, the people, asked us to, and we are fulfilling the mandate that you set. That's a really important sort of message for people, and there is some, although limited, and we're trying to add to it, evidence that people do trust decisions that are that they feel have been examined and supported by people like them, as opposed to, or as well as, experts. So there's a lot that they could do to change the sort of process of policy making and the way that they talk about developing strategies that I think would be, well, electorally successful, but also build that public mandate for climate action.
It's interesting you say that, because I've got a couple of questions here. Question from Vijay Srao. Surely failure to burn carbon has made the UK relatively poorer and more unequal than its peers. The UK is an exemplar of deindustrialization and decarbonisation. I mean, we saw some local pressure in local council around the Cumbria mine. We might as well be supplying the UK steel industry. We saw Labour coming under pressure, I think, from the GMB around its attitude towards North Sea licensing. So might we, are we picking a sort of growth strategy? How do we deal with those people who really are concerned about sort of local benefits from fossil fuel-based industries? What's the answer there to that sort of local pressure or union pressure? Anyone? Becky, you were involved in the Cumbrian coal mine. Tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, it's been dragging on a while, that coal mine. It's back in the courts in January, apparently. So I think that the trick for local areas, and in fact for all policy, is to be very, very clear about the direction of travel, and be much more open about the route there and how particular sectors of the economy and particular geographical areas handle that. So devolution within, but a devolution of responsibilities as well as policies. So there should some time ago have been a very clear bit of policy or legislation saying we are not going to open any more sites of fossil fuel extraction. Wales did it. Other countries have done it. There's no reason why the UK couldn't have done that, applying to both North Sea oil and gas and the rogue coal mine in Cumbria. So that offer is just off the table. Having said that, you also need to pay a lot more attention to the circumstances of areas like West Cumbria, heavily dependent on nuclear jobs, heavily dependent on a monolithic employer. Unsurprisingly, is happy when another sort of big industrial player comes along and says, we'll give you some jobs. There's been absolutely nothing else on the table for West Cumbria apart from nuclear and this and the fantasy of a coal mine. And so when you say to people in the area, as I know plenty of people who have, look, here's a report saying about the 9,000 green jobs. Well, they quite rightly turn around and say, what's 9,000 green jobs in a report? And they haven't seen any sign of any kind of green jobs in the area, and so they're quite understandably cynical. I think that compares with other areas like the Humber and the wind cluster in the Humber, where there has been sort of there have been real jobs created, and there's been quite a buzz about it. I think the same is true in areas of Scotland, though obviously not Aberdeen. So you can see that happening, but it's very patchy, very sporadic at the moment. So I think tying climate strategy very closely together with economic strategy is really important. And this is a good thing about the 28 billion, because since that's the only money Labour announced ever, right, all the other ministers are trying to claim that their whatever investment they want should fall under that 28 billion. I think that's great, because all investment should be seen as climate investment, and if it's something that if it's something that brings jobs to an area and is a big investment in some form of net zero, something that gets us to net zero, that's absolutely brilliant. So I want all the Labour leaders to be squabbling over Rachel's 28 billion. I think that's a great result.
Okay, well, just a warning, Becky, that you might find lots of things labelled net zero spending,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
some of the
yeah.
way
We
in
could,
which
yeah, yeah.
the
It needs to be
programs
patrolled and policed for sure. Yeah.
aid programs prove quite elastic. Shane, you want to come in, and then I've got a whole bunch of questions about some of the co-disbenefits of climate action, and then I want to come on to UK EU global leadership to come back to the start. But Shane.
Yeah, I'll be quick because I think Becky's sort of said a lot of this. I think on the overall point, I think it is really worth emphasizing the decoupling that the UK has done between its emissions and its GDP growth. So I think it's right from 1985 to sort of 2015, 2016, we grew by over 70% our GDP. We reduced our emissions by over a third. So there has been this decoupling effect. It is not that there is this absolute trade-off between growth and climate action. They go hand in hand together. And as we see the progress that we make on low carbon technologies, renewables are becoming the cheapest of all forms of energy as we go forward. This effect will continue. I think Becky's absolutely right to sort of emphasize the need for local solutions as we go forward, and it's worth emphasizing that the UK is, I think, in the G20, the most centralized country in terms of how we spend our infrastructure investment, how we spend government money. And so there is a real need to have a look again at what are our local solutions for things like energy efficiency, for things like renewables, infrastructure and charging. We need to be able to build those in the local environments where they work. And if we are successful in that, then people will start to see the benefits. That's where you get the jobs and the creation. So it's not just about doing top-down centralized solutions to this. We really do need to invest in more distributed processes as we go forward.
Okay, Andy, I just wanted you to respond to one or two questions we're getting. I want to spend the last few minutes talking about the sort of international picture. Has the emphasis on climate change made processing of sewage more expensive? To an extent, it's more climate friendly just to dump it in rivers. Question whether the emphasis on climate's led us to do things that is bad for air pollution. We saw that, I think, with biofuels at one stage, but with some negative externalities, and diesel, of course. But burning biomass, bad for that. Also got something there about some backsliding in the EU. But are we managing the co-disbenefits, if you like, of climate action? There's another one about whether energy costs, I suppose the costs of moving towards net zero, have put up food prices. So let's do a very quick tour of externalities from action on climate change.
Well, climate change and sewage, we're really getting down to brass tacks now, aren't we? Well, we can laugh about it, but actually sewage and the treatment of sewage is a very, very carbon intensive business. And it's made much harder by the impacts of climate change, not least these sudden intense rain events, which many of the climate models suggest are much more likely and as the climate heats up. So really, really important. Although I suspect that we have to go a lot further, though, to push the water industry on sewage discharges for non-climate reasons before we start to think about the climate reasons, as important as they
I think it's maybe suggesting that by making, emphasizing on that, it's just we're pushing up the prices, but that may just be a general energy price shift, which is not particularly climate induced.
On the use of biofuels, I mean, originally they were used in cars and vehicles, and now the airline industry wants a part of the action as well, and that's seen as a sort of silver bullet for the problem of rising emissions from the air transport sector. I think this takes us to the broader point which I wanted to make, which is, and that connects back to Shane's point about what happens when we've completely decarbonized the energy supply, electricity supply sector, which Labour, interestingly, has promised it would do, I think, by 2030. Well, we'll see whether it will or not, but that's still a significant goal to aim for. What happens after that? The Climate Change Committee says then we've got to really, really start to look at emissions from outside of that sector, and that basically takes us into the area of behavior change, of behaviors of individuals, the way that people heat their homes, that people travel around, the way that they feed themselves and their families. And this is really, really politically potentially difficult terrain in which to operate. And I think one of the tests of the political parties when they start to launch their manifestos from a climate change perspective is how serious are they about dealing with behavior change and pushing forward behavior change. I mean, so many really important heavyweight reports in recent years, not least the Skidmore Review, have said that we really desperately need a convincing strategy on behavior change.
Okay. Shane, I just want to bring it back in the last few minutes where other people in the world, because the UK is not going to solve the emissions problem on its own. Mark English is asking whether the EU's resiling from green measure, where it says EU resiling is a big question mark in Brussels. Does Brexit and UK make backsliding make that more likely? Questions about whether the UK still cooperates on climate. You have offices in Brussels and Berlin. You're very well connected. I mean, what's the European scene? Is that sort of following the UK backwards? Is the UK following an EU trend? I mean, we're aligned with the EU later date on electric vehicles. We've seen Germany hitting the buffers with its heat pump scheme. So where is Europe on this now?
It's a lot to do in 5 minutes, but I will do my best.
I was giving you two, but
anyway,
I'm going to bring the others in.
So I think, at a meta level, Europe remains committed to action on climate change. The European Green Deal is continuing. It is a really flagship initiative, and I think demonstrates that. There are global issues which, as we've talked about, the banning and backlash that may come from that in the UK. Europe is by no means immune to that. We've seen it in Germany and we've seen it in France and some other countries as well, and we may see more. So we need smart policy everywhere as we go forward. I think what I'd say is that the UK is still, physically and politically enmeshed in what happens in Europe as we go forward. And so, although Brexit has obviously now happened, it does not mean that Europe is something that we can ignore or forget about. It is going to be vital to that. So the UK remains critically interconnected with Europe for a lot of its energy, particularly its electricity. We trade that back and forth, and being able to maximise that opportunity is going to be a key part of keeping costs down as we expand intermittent renewables as we go forward. And it also matters what policies Europe does. So as Europe contemplates a carbon border adjustment mechanism, a CBAM, so the UK is contemplating a carbon border adjustment mechanism, with one of the primary aims of the UK being to ensure that the European CBAM does not apply to the UK, so that we can have better trading as we go forward. So what happens in Europe still really does impact the UK as we go forward. And in 2025, there'll be an opportunity to renegotiate the TCA, so that the core agreement that was part of Brexit, and there'll be a number of climate and energy elements that will be a critical part of that. And so definitely Europe remains committed to climate action. There is still backlash there. The UK has to continue to engage with Europe, and I think we're going to have a big moment in 2025 as we think about that.
Since we've got a report on this, I have to say that the EU would say it's just a technical implementation review in 2025-26, not a major renegotiation. But there are potentially opportunities.
We shall see.
Things beyond that. Read our excellent report. Andy, are there things that the UK can do outside the EU that we couldn't have done as an EU member in terms of climate leadership or in terms of climate change policy?
Yes, we can. I think we can, as a country now, start to deal with all those sorts of things that sit behind the border. The things like nature protection, environmental impact assessment, those sorts of things that where we have more autonomy. I think we have less autonomy for the reasons that Shane gave in relation to traded products. But the problem is that in the last few years, the Conservatives have seemed to want to go backwards on many of these sorts of behind the border issues, sewage treatment as well, water pollution, these sorts of things. So I think many environmentalists are concerned that the extra autonomy that the UK has achieved as a result of Brexit are not really being used for pro-environmental purposes. And just to finish off, I think the other, and to add to Shane's general response, I think what's crucially different about what the EU's been doing in recent years and what the UK's been doing, the UK's, to go right back to the beginning of this conversation, been slipping back and rolling back, whereas the EU, although it's had problems getting packages of policy through the Council of Ministers and particularly the Parliament, policies have only sort of paused. They've not actually gone backwards, and in many respects they've also gone forwards, and that's a big difference.
Okay, I've got 1 minute and I'm going to ask you 2 questions. One to Becky. Top rated question is, what about climate activism, things like Extinction Rebellion? Is that helpful in pushing either party into action? And then just as a final one from all of you, who are the real international leaders on we should be looking at COP28 and beyond? So Becky, climate activism, good or bad for getting this up the mainstream political agenda?
I mean, anything that anything that puts the spotlight on climate change is really necessary. It's just the evidence is very clear that protest helps to shift government on this. The more people out on the streets, the better. I think the caveat for me is that it's easy for me to sit here and order the kind of activism I would like, but the kind of activism I would like, Jill, is activism from the non-usual suspects. So, I think it's brilliant. So there's a brilliant group called Parents for Future, where they just pitch themselves as worried parents, and they go and hang out outside Lloyd's of London and complain about what they're insuring. Women's Institute, Scouts, whoever, people who you wouldn't sort of necessarily see as climate activists. That's where, if I think for both Labour and the Tories, they'd start getting really worried if that's who was barricading them.
Your pick for climate leader.
Yeah, and I would just say, in answer to your second question, I don't think this is about which country should we be looking to. I think this is about, what sources of inspiration are there for, the things, the fact that, well, Wales is a country. They've said that they won't consent any more coal mining. They've got all their brilliant stuff around involving future generations and their children's commissioner. You look at youth activism, still really dynamic. There are so many sources, and certainly climate concern and the vocalness of people talking about climate is just so much stronger than it was sort of 5 or 10 years ago, and that's what gives me the sort of determination to carry on in what is inevitably a sort of difficult field.
Okay, Shane, very quickly, your climate one to watch leader.
I would agree with what Becky was saying, but I think the key thing about the UN, and why I will defend the UN process as being central to this, is that it includes the alliance of small island states and the most vulnerable countries. And those are when you put those voices politically in a room, you get a different answer than when it's just the G20 or the G7. And so these are those small island states that will genuinely disappear, and this is a real existential crisis if we do not solve climate change. Those are the voices that we really need to amplify and listen to.
Brilliant. And final word, Andy.
I think with the election coming up, perhaps sooner rather than later, I think the environmental groups will be looking very closely at the manifestos. The things really to look for, I think, are what positions are they taking on new fossil fuel development and expansion? Secondly, on airport expansion. And thirdly, I think, on behaviour change.
Okay, so that's your manifesto watch if you want to be rated as a leader going into the next election. So with that, I'm going to bring this to a close. Thanks very much to Andy Jordan, Shane Tomlinson and Becky Willis for a very lively chat. Thank you all for so many huge numbers of questions, which have meant I've slightly overrun. Anand Menon would sack me if I didn't say, if you want to know more about what UKICE Changing Europe's been up to this year, but crucially what we're doing next year, which looks to be a very exciting year, please do sign up to our newsletter and you will find out everything we're doing actually at the same time as everyone else. I can't promise you'll get it in advance. So please do that. And I'm just going to thank the panel on your behalf. So thank you very much.